Hi A&P1 students. In this video, we are going to start talking about some of the characteristics of the neurons. And the reason that we want to include some information about the neurons in this skeletal muscle chapter is because it's the neurons that are going to stimulate the skeletal muscle cells or fibers to contract. So we need to understand, so we understand the whole process, we need to understand a little bit of the anatomy of our neurons, and those are the nerve cells of our nervous system. So they're the ones that are responsible for sending nerve impulses. And so we're going to focus on the anatomy of the neuron this week, as well as the anatomy that we just went over in the last couple of videos about the skeletal muscle cell anatomy. So I'm going to go to our objectives and show you where we're at. That's not the objective, sorry. There we go. So in our last video, we talked about the myofibrils and their structures. So we're on to like motor units and neuromuscular junction. So this has to deal with the neuron and the nervous system. So what I want to do so we understand those two objectives a little bit better is to talk about the neurons and talk about their basic features and how they send a nerve impulse, what direction it goes and then we'll talk also about where they communicate with each other and with other cells. And then we'll come back to our objectives 7 and 8. All right, so in our textbook, I kind of skipped to the nervous system chapter, which I believe is chapter 12. And I'm on page 456, and there's a picture of a neuron. I'm going to show the whole thing here. So what we want to be familiar with when it comes to the neuron is its basic parts. And so this is showing one neuron, so it's this yellow that you see. And then realize that underneath these little blue sheaths is also part of the neuron that's yellow, and then it ends in these little structures here. So the parts that we want to be familiar with, the basic parts of a neuron, first we want to recognize the shape. So definitely a much different shape than our skeletal muscle cells, which are long and cylindrical. Definitely these neurons can be long, but primarily it's their processes or extensions that are really, really long, so like this one. And then there's these extensions as well that can be long. And so the three basic parts of any neuron is they always have a cell body, so that's the widest or largest part of a neuron. And in that cell body is where you'll find the nucleus. And they will have just one nucleus. And then you can see some organelles in there as well. So that's the cell body. And then coming off of the cell body, you'll see these processes. And these are called the dendrites. So each one of those processes is a dendrite. So dendrite is listed there, cell body's there. And then generally you'll have a process. Depends on the type of neuron, but generally you'll have a process that's much, much longer than the dendrites, and it has a different role too. It's a little bit structurally different. And that's called the axon. So axon is there. So that whole long process is called the axon. And then when you get to the very end of the axon, you'll notice that it branches out. And at the end of each of those branches is a little bulb, they call it. So they'll call it a synaptic bulb. Also, sometimes they'll call it an axon terminal because it's at the end of the axon. So they'll call it an axon terminal as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about the synapse part, why it's called a synaptic bulb there. So those are the main parts that you should be able to identify on a neuron. So the dendrites, which are the shorter processes relative to the axon, and then the cell body with its nucleus, and then the axon, and then you can call these axon terminals, each one of those little ends, or a synaptic bulb. You can call them synaptic bulbs as well. So those are the parts of a neuron. And again, that's some anatomy that we need to understand in this muscle chapter that will help us understand their role in skeletal muscle contraction, because again, their role is they have to stimulate the skeletal muscles to contract. So we need to know a little bit more information about how they do that. So we need to understand their basic anatomy. And when we get to chapter 12 and specifically talk about the nervous system, then we'll talk about more details about the neurons. But for now, best to know the basic parts. So I'm going to go back to our objectives. So we talked about the cell body, dendrites, axon, and I'll probably, if I can, add on axon terminal or synaptic bulb. That'll be important when we talk about muscle contraction. Okay, so the next objective that we'll talk about is, so these, remember, are neurons, and they're sending nerve impulses. That's their role in the nervous system, is to send an impulse and stimulate other cells. So they could stimulate another neuron, or they could stimulate a skeletal muscle cell, which is what we're going to talk about. They could stimulate a gland cell, so a cell that's like part of a gland. So, so they're there to stimulate and send a signal or a nerve impulse to various cells in the body. So the other thing that we need to know is what direction the nerve impulse travels. So the nerve impulse always goes in one direction, so it's unidirectional. And the nerve impulse is always going to start at the dendrites. So we'll pick one of these dendrites. So let's say that this nerve impulse starts at this dendrite. And then it will travel, the nerve impulse will travel along the dendrite to the cell body. And then it'll travel along the cell body, and then it'll travel down the axon all the way to the axon terminals or synaptic bulbs. So that is always the direction of the nerve impulse in any neuron, or at least in this particular type of neuron. So it travels along the dendrites, cell body, down the axon to the synaptic bulb or axon terminals. So we need to be familiar with the direction of that nerve impulse. So it's going to end at the synaptic bulb or the axon terminals. All right, so that was this objective here. Okay, now the next objective is over a synapse, understanding what a synapse is. And so we need to be familiar with the definition of a synapse. And a synapse is going to be that location where a neuron is going to communicate to another cell. And again, it could communicate with another neuron, it could be communicating with another muscle cell or a gland cell. So I'm going to show you a picture. So this is a picture that's showing, so hopefully you can kind of recognize that this is one of the branches of the axon. You got like 3 of them here. And then at the end, it's kind of bulb-like, so they call those synaptic bulbs or axon terminals. So there's one there, one here, and one here. And then what this is here, they actually are using a nerve cell in this case, like a neuron, another neuron. So this is like the neuron cell, so like inside here, and this is its plasma membrane. So where this particular neuron is going to communicate with this particular neuron is at a synapse. So the synapse is this location. So it's between the synaptic bulb or axon terminal of this neuron, and then between the plasma membrane of this neuron. So that's the synapse. So we need to be familiar with what a synapse is, because we're going to talk about, when we talk about muscle, skeletal muscle physiology, this is where the events happen, is at the synapse. At least the first events happen is at the synapse. So we're going to talk about those particular steps that happen here in order for this neuron to communicate with this cell, which is another neuron. But our cell's actually going to be a skeletal muscle cell here when we get to that point. Okay, so in the next video, we are going to, now that we know some anatomy of our nervous system, now we're going to talk about the motor units, and we're also going to talk about our, let me see if I can get rid of that. We're also going to talk about our neuromuscular junction. So And that is actually a synapse. So that's good that we know what a synapse is. So we'll understand that particular learning objective a little bit more. So I will see you in the next video.